Hello, everyone. This is LifeWorks Ministries. I'm Gary Howington, and this is the place where the issues of social life and culture intersect with the issues of faith. If you're ready, let's get started.
Brother Hamilton, I was wanting to kind of give our audience an idea of where you got your start, more or less, not only in ministry, but where you got your start that kind of molded what you are as far as your characteristics of not only what kind of forms your thought process, but how you grew up, more or less. You're a product of the '60s. You're a product of the '70s, of the generation of people that grew up and started a certain movement in our society that we're still seeing in our politics. We're still seeing in our lives today and in common culture, but also we're seeing it in our churches.
Yes.
Because of that, and kind of give us a background so that the listeners who don't know who you are, the viewers who don't know who you are, they'll see, understand where you come from and how you kind of were formed from adolescence or even childhood on up to who you are today.
Well, I was a child that was born in the 50s, and I grew up in an idyllic little place that I often tell people it was a real life Mayberry. I grew up in a little town where you rode your bicycle all day if you were a young boy, and you had your baseball glove on the handlebars, and you just rode and found the baseball game, and summers were long and lazy, and we had a great idyllic life. Everybody knew everybody in town, and everybody knew all the people. A very small town, probably around 1,000 people in the town. But I was born in the 50s, but I came of age, and I went through my adolescence and my transition from being just a boy or a child to becoming a young man during the turbulent times of the 60s. And back in those days, it was prior to computers and prior to internet and all of that. So all we had was local television stations. We had music, and we had magazines, and we had radio, and we had different ways of finding out what was going on. But what I saw in the late 60s that was going on in our nation, in the large cities of our nation, it did reverberate, and it did trickle down into the smaller communities through the pop culture and through the music culture. And I'd always been desirous to be a musician. Even when I was just a young boy, I got my first guitar when I was about 9 or 10 years old.
Sears and Roebuck.
Yeah, Sears and Roebuck, a $29 little Sears and Roebuck guitar. But you have to remember that back in those days, that was not necessarily a terrible thing, because everybody got their starter guitars from Sears. But I started out when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I had a lot of country influences in the music that I played. And the reason I mention music so much is because music was such a formative thing in my life. I was 9 years old in February of 1964, and I remember watching the Beatles with my older brother, and him telling me about who they were, and that was their first visit to America, and it absolutely transformed some things. And all of a sudden, everybody all over town was forming little garage bands, and I played in several of those little garage bands growing up, starting at the age, I think my first public performance was when I was 10 years old. Yeah. Playing in a little garage band. We weren't any good, but we did have a couple of public gigs that we went to. But I would stand in front of the mirror when I was a boy, because I had, not only did I have the British invasion influences in my life, but I also had gospel music and country and Western music. And the big stars of those days were men that a lot of people of perhaps your generation wouldn't know that much about. People like Buck Owens and Merle Haggard and George Jones. Of course, if you're a country music aficionado, you would know all of those names. But I would stand in front of the mirror, and I would play my guitar, and I would try to imitate those guys. But it was long about 1967 that something very socially, culturally changed. Socially and culturally changed in our nation. It was the Summer of Love in 1967 in San Francisco, and there were a lot of things that came out of that. And slowly but surely, the things that changed culturally began to move in waves across our nation. And as I went from boyhood into my early and mid teens, those were the influences that began to predominate. And there was a whole lot of interest in if it feels good, do it, that sort of philosophy, and playing rock and roll music. But the truth of the matter is, Brother Devin, but long before any of that happened, when I was just a lad of 6 years old, I remember sitting in a little small Sunday school room in a little denominational church there in my hometown. I was sitting there all alone. Back in those days, they had little wooden chairs for the toddlers and they looked like adult-sized chairs, but they were just little wooden chairs. I remember that distinctly because the rooms were furnished with those, and I felt something touching me and speaking to me. And as a young lad, I really didn't know what it was. But in retrospect, I look back now, and I can honestly say I believe that it was the voice of God. And he was dealing with me and speaking to me about one day being a servant to his kingdom and to his ministry. I went through a long circuitous route to get to where we are today, because when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I started embracing the values that I was seeing coming across the television screen and through the music that we were listening to. I grew up in a very stable home. We had a nuclear family. I'm a stay-at-home mom and a working class dad. He was a plumbing and electrical contractor. We weren't rich people, but we always had a stable living, and we always knew that when we came home from school in the afternoon, that Dad would be coming home a little while later from work, and Mom would be there with a snack ready for us. So we had a very traditional life in that respect. The little school that I went to, you started in the first grade on one end of the building, and when you worked your way out the other end of the building, you were a graduate when you got out the other end of the building. And that's the kind of school, and that was typical of that day and time. But when I was about 14 or 15, I began to drift away from some of those traditional values. I drifted away from my attendance to church, and a lot of the things that were in me became latent. The values that I had as a young boy and as an adolescent became latent. And in my early teens, I began to wander away from those things, and alcohol and rock and roll music and substance abuse. All of those things went hand in hand. And as we developed our skills, my brother and I, we formed different bands, different manifestations of rock and roll bands. And for about 10 years, I was really wandering far, totally embracing the pop culture life of the 60s and the 70s. Yeah. And to me, it got to the place, and this is just my personal testimony, but I believe it rings true with so many people, that I got to the place where the things that I was seeing and the things that I was doing no longer had any satisfaction to me. And I began to question within myself, is this really all that there is? Yeah. Is it just supposed to be fun? Am I just supposed to engage in substance abuse and alcohol abuse and play rock and roll music and pursue the hedonistic, not heathenistic, but hedonistic lifestyle? Or should there be some higher purpose for life? And I remember that on Sunday afternoons, after a long weekend of doing what I did, I would be lying on the couch there in my living room, and I'd just be thinking to myself, is this really all there is to it? Yeah. But what that did was eventually that brought me back to looking at the Bible as perhaps a method of finding a purpose and a reason for life. And when I began to do that, things began to change, and I began to contact old friends that had transitioned away from the life that I was living and had embraced traditional values of Christianity.
Now, why were you drawn to the Bible? I mean, other than your old roots of being brought to that stuff, I mean, why do people get drawn to the Bible?
Well, I think that first of all, that God gave the Word with the intention that it would influence and impact our lives. But what I saw in the Bible that I thought was very important and was significant to me was the fact that it gave a structure and it had a set of absolutes. I had watched our culture from my boyhood days to my early teens. I had watched our world and our culture abandon so many things, and instead of it bringing liberation, what it did was it brought confusion. Mm-hmm. Because when there are no boundaries and no parameters for conduct and for life view, and we throw it all up in the air and say, okay, anything goes, because the saying of the 60s was, if it feels good, you ought to do it.
Yeah.
And what that did was, that didn't liberate us. What that did was, that caused a lot of confusion and chaos.
Well, the problem I think you run into a lot of times is just like we run into today. Not to cut in on you, but
No.
you come into a place where I think that your whatever feels good, do it, may run, obstruct against somebody else's contrary to the person next to you, and somebody else's might be more liberal than yours. And we have to have absolutes that say this is right and this is wrong no matter what, or it gets to a place where it gets too blurry on a one-on-one case-by-case basis.
Well, I heard a very wise lady say one time that the difference between a river and a swamp is that the power of the river is contained within the boundaries which make it follow its course. When you knock those boundaries down, that water goes everywhere, and what once was a flowing, powerful, mighty river becomes a swamp. And I believe, and I'm not here to bash culture. I'm just saying that I believe many people are looking for something that makes their life have more significance than just a hedonistic pursuits. And also, I might add, I believe that the Bible gives us a transcendent life view that makes us know that it's more than just having a 9-to-5 job 5 days a week and 2 weeks vacation in the summertime and a retirement and a gold watch after 30 or 40 years somewhere. I believe that God intended that to be that way, and I believe that He spoke to us through His Word. But whenever I went back to the Word of God, I went back to the Word of God with a clean slate as far as my mind was concerned. All I wanted to do was find out, look at it, see what it said, because part of my if it feels good, just do it philosophy allowed me that liberty to say, well, perhaps this is what I might want to do. How would I know? I've drifted so far away from it. Maybe I ought to revisit this and perhaps see if this is something that I really might want to do.
Yeah. And how old were you whenever this all transitioned? You said 10 years. You was about wandering. So
I started with the substance abuse and the alcohol abuse when I was probably around 14, and I was 25. And I had a transformational experience. I found some things in the Bible that I never had recognized and realized were there. And I had one of those literal, like Jesus told Nicodemus, one of those born-again experiences, or like Paul on the road to Damascus when Saul of Tarsus was miraculously, supernaturally transformed into Paul the Apostle. Yeah. Something like that actually happened to me. And I experienced it firsthand, and it was a transformative thing. The Bible calls it being filled with the Spirit of God, and that's what happened. And it happened just a few weeks prior to my 25th birthday. I'm 63 now. That was 38 plus years ago, and it still is exciting and vibrant now as it was back then. And I started out being a Sunday school teacher, and then a youth pastor, and then a music leader, a worship leader, outreach director, associate pastor, a senior pastor, and now I'm at the age in life where I'm trying to mentor and develop other young ministers to come along for their generation, and trying to impart to them some of the things and some of the energy and the passion and the relevancy that I found. Because after 38 years, I still believe that what I discovered back there when I was 25 years old is still the relevant answer for our people and our world today. And that's part of what motivated us to do LifeWorks Ministries, because we believe that this is a way to impart to another generation some of those same values and help a younger generation to find relevancy for their culture and for their society. Even though technology and much of our world has changed, I mean, it doesn't even resemble the world that I grew up in as a boy, riding his bicycle in the little small idyllic Mayberry. I realized that the world has tremendously changed, but the relevancy that the values that I found still work.
That's right.
LifeWorks Ministries.
Yeah, and one other thing I noticed, and it's something that seems almost inherent with your generation and the generation prior to yours, the baby boomers that were prior to yours. or maybe not even the baby boomers. But
Actually,
the ones,
I'm right in the middle of the boomers
you
generation.
are a baby boomer,
Yes, sir.
or a
Born
post baby boomer.
right in the middle of the boomer generation.
Well, the World War II generation, I forget what they're called, but anyways,
they were called the greatest generation.
the greatest generation.
And the reason was because they were.
They were great. That's right.
They were great.
Well, something I noticed about your generation, the baby boomers and the greatest generation, is this. And I guess the best term I can come up with is a bulldog tenacity, that whenever you get something and you find something to be true, and you hit on it a little bit, talking about in our culture today where there's no parameters that are set in stone, that we say this is a definite, surefire thing and we're not going to let it go because this is important in our lives. And I think this, and a lot of people don't realize this about Brother Houghton, and that's that, throughout the years that I've known you, which has been all my life, and throughout the years that the people that I've been around him have known him, he has bought into an ideology, a thing that he lives by, that he found that works, and he hasn't let it go. And that's why people are drawn to him, is not because are they asking questions and are doing things like this and they're listening to him, is because he's bought into this thing, and I think it's a thing that's not always inherent with your generation, but it was much more inherent with the generation prior to yours even. But how can we get back? I guess the meat of my question is, how can our generation get to the place that we get to that idea that we'll buy into that and we'll clinch on to what you have, where we say there's some absolutes in our lives and we can't let them go, because if we begin to let them go, then like you said, it becomes a swamp in life.
Dr. Martin Luther King made a quote one time, and I've always admired his way of expressing himself, and the fact that he lived his life for something larger than himself. He said, until a man has discovered something worth dying for, he doesn't have anything worth living for.
That's right.
And the truth of the matter is, that is the value system. My predecessors expressed it in the fact that they left the farms and went to foreign lands and fought the foes of freedom.
That's right.
And preserved something for our nation. And I don't believe that I am that far removed from the value system of my father's generation, in so much that I found something that gave me a principle that was worth everything. It was I buy into this, I invest into this, and I'm not saying that to heap nobility upon myself. It's just that when I discovered something larger than myself and saw what it did for my inner man, my thought life, for my outer man, how it brought system and order to my life, and how it gave me a set of values that work in any generation, I thought, why wouldn't I want to spend my life in pursuit of this goal? Because I realized, and I still realize till today, that it doesn't matter what generation. When I came to this 38 years ago, there were people that I looked up to that were already 70 and 80 years old.
Yeah.
And it worked for them.
Yeah.
It worked for my parents' generation, because I knew many people that were practicing these things in that generation.
Yes.
I appropriated it as a young man coming out of the hippie culture with long hair and the rock and roll music and the substance and all abuse and all that stuff. And I saw that it made for lives that worked.
Yeah.
And then when I began to have my children, and we've got 3 adult children now and 5 grandchildren now, and I saw that it worked for them, and I also see it taking root in my grandchildren's lives. So that's 5 generations, something that has been consistently working and producing what it promised to produce for 5 generations. I think that's something that we can count on. And I think that's something that we should look to as a possibility of speaking order and speaking serenity and peace. Because you see, the goal is to be happy.
Yeah.
But the goal also in life, should we just seek happiness? Yes, but we have to seek happiness in a certain way, because if we take the values of the Bible tells us that we were created by God, And God had a relationship in mind that brought serenity, peace, and happiness to us. And it pleased us because it brought us into communion with Him. And when I found out that I could have all of those things by going to the values of the Bible, I said, this is what I want to do with my life.
Sold out.
And once again, if I could plug our ministry, LifeWorks Ministries, because we have found some things that absolutely, when they're applied properly, will improve people's lives.
Yeah.